Welcome to The World Today. I'm Waqas Majeed Khan. Today we have an interesting topic to discuss, and that is President Trump's trade wars that he has initiated as a result of his policies. Many countries are up in arms against Donald Trump's trade policies, including Mexico, China, Canada, the European Union. That is what we're going to be talking about today. To begin the conversation, let me introduce my guests in the studio. Joining me for this conversation, first of all, we have former Ambassador Zamir Akram Saab with us, and joining him we have Dr. Noor Fatima, who's a political economist. Thank you very much, sir, for being here. Sir, it seems that President Trump is hell-bent on shaking the global world trade order. Do you think that the policies that he has announced recently and the reactions that he is getting from across the world may end up damaging the U.S. in the long run rather than helping the U.S. shore up more money?
No, I think that it will damage the U.S. interests, U.S. business. It will harm the U.S. consumer. So overall, in the long run, my guess is that my estimate is that it will harm the U.S. His election promise, this is an election promise mainly designed to help protect American jobs. But he is looking at it in a very narrow prism, because with the existence of globalization, which in fact the U.S. was the moving force, the Washington Consensus and all that bit, the creation of the World Trade Organization and everything, now he is trying to undermine that whole arrangement. This is a global understanding that has led to this kind of globalized trading system. And by doing that, of course, the other countries will be forced to retaliate, and they will, as they have announced, impose their own tariffs. And China is the United States' largest trading partner. And of course, Canada and the others are also very important. EU are also very. So if they all collectively start imposing tariffs on American products, then American jobs will go down, because American productivity will go down. There will be no market for them.
That's what we are seeing happening. But let me ask Dr. Noor Fatima her opinion. In your opinion, ma'am, what short-term benefits was Mr. Donald Trump envisioning when he announced these policies? Because they seem to be detrimental, and every economist in the world has said that they will have repercussions for the U.S. economy in a negative way.
Actually, if you look at Trump's personality, right from the beginning when he was contesting his election campaign, he was more on the anti-globalization kind of a thought, and he was always protectionist. He came up with the protectionist ideas, and he was building a wall, and always this immigration issues. And now that he has faced a lot of repercussion on his own policies, sometimes from the court, sometimes from the Congress, and from his own party. But he is in a way, I think he's adventurous in a way that he takes a policy, he tries to implement it, and then he faces it later, and then he rolls it back. I think what he thinks at this moment is that through this protectionism, probably he is going to stop the more invasion of the Chinese market into the American, Chinese interest into the American market. That is his prime job. Now the point is that, as Ambassador Saab has said rightly, that he will face the retaliation. And retaliation is coming from right now is coming from the EU as well, because EU is himself is allying itself with the China against the US this protectionist policy of the trade. And what Trump is thinking, that the whole international financial system, economic system, is rigged against the U.S. economic interests.
Well, that's just his perception. How far is that true? We'll discuss that as well. Ambassador Saab, as Madam was also mentioning, the European and Chinese officials are now taking steps based on a multilateral approach to strengthen their own trade ties as a result of Donald Trump's policy. How is that going to affect the U.S. economy as well as the global economy?
Well, I was just reading before the program started that the American economy is right now, the stock exchange there are dangers of a recession already starting to set in.
Right.
Because these people, the investors, are worried as to how these trade wars is going to affect the economy. not just the US economy, but the entire international economy. Now, this kind of recession can be disastrous for all the entire economic system, and including the United States. So I think that they need to step back from this brink. If the US does have some genuine concerns about unfair trading practices by the others, there is a forum that's available to them, that's the World Trade Organization. They should go there and try and resolve those disputes using that organization's dispute mechanisms. They have problems or concerns about intellectual property rights, in the American inventions that
Especially in China.
In China, etc. Well, there again, you have WIPO as another organization that can help resolve these kind of differences. But taking such kind of unilateralist approach is, in the end, I think, going to hurt the Americans. It's going to hurt the international business environment. I mean, if anyone has been to the US and you go to a supermarket or you go to any kind of store, almost all the articles, the consumer goods, are made in China.
Absolutely.
And they are affordable. And the American consumer has grown up on these kind of affordable consumer items. Now, if there are tariffs, those consumer prices, those items are going to become more expensive, and so eventually it will hurt the American consumer.
Absolutely, sir. And if we look at the moves that Donald Trump is making in terms of the economy, and you also just mentioned about the fears of a recession which is imminent, do you think that's also going to lead to a wider global recession, as we've seen recently as well?
Yes, we can anticipate that on the basis of our 2008 recession. Now, when there will be a larger retaliation from EU, from China, and from other countries, also from Latin American countries maybe, and then it will trigger the many industries and many goods industries also. For instance, car industry also. So there will be more duty on the cars and the less manufacturing of the cars, and then less consumption, and of course the less jobs. And then it will affect the whole economic system of the world. And then, of course, now the role comes of the international institutions, which are Bretton Woods institutions, and also the WTO. Let's see how they play their role.
A very interesting situation is developing. We've heard the Europeans and the Chinese talk a lot about rules-based world order or rules-based business, which the US is now walking away from. In your opinion, sir, or if you could just for our audience's benefit explain what exactly is rules-based trade or the rules-based world order that the Europeans and Chinese are talking about?
Well, one of them is, of course, the major international institution is the World Trade Organization in terms of trade. But when we talk about the rules-based international order, this is where which is why I mentioned the Washington Consensus and this whole idea about globalization and how globalization is going to facilitate growth globally, right? Now, there are obviously differences with that, particularly between developed and developing countries, and there are other kind of issues. But that's the kind of rules-based approach. WIPO I mentioned, Professor Saib mentioned the Bretton Woods institutions. These are all, the United Nations itself, so these are all organizations that provide a certain basis through which countries are engaging with each other in terms of trade, but also in terms of political relations. Now, Mr. Trump has come with an agenda which is sort of America first, which means that in pursuit of American interests, he is prepared to completely ignore the interests of other countries. And that simply will undermine that international order.
That doesn't seem like a very wise approach to the entire issue. Madam, in your opinion, how can the president justify this narrow-minded approach when dealing with something as huge as the global economy? Because every decision that the US now makes affects the entire globe.
Actually, he is going against the idea of the hegemon, basically. When he thinks that he is the hegemon of the world, he has to think in that particular context of the issue. He thinks in a very narrow way as a business mind only, a minded person, and he wants only to create job through this cut of the things and the increase of the duties, which is not the superpower has to do something with broader than that. And of course, superpower has to follow certain rules also, and that is also the WTO and the World Bank and the IMF and the United States. And unfortunately, they follow all that line of action which comes from, of course, again from the America. So there is a less chance for the world to see the justice. And this economic order of the world is based on the relative gains. It's not on the absolute gains. And probably Trump is going towards absolute gain vis-a-vis the China. That I think might work for a time being. The American people, an ordinary citizen of the US might think that it will bring some good to them, but in the longer run, it might be very damaging for American international interest, for American international sentiments for US citizen, US government itself, and for American business itself.
Absolutely, that's what it seems to be heading towards. If you look at the trade between China and Europe, that is roughly $1 billion a day. With these additional policy changes that are coming about as a result of Mr. Trump's thinking, how is that going to affect international trade? Is it going to cause disruption in international trade as a result of his policies?
I think that there will be an attempt to readjust to this environment, unless, of course, the US sees reason and backs down and does not go through with this kind of approach that they have right now. And the chances are that American interests themselves, American business interests themselves, will require President Trump to kind of rethink this approach. But if that does not happen, then of course global trade, particularly among the major economies, China is now the world's second largest economy, and they, along with other major economies like Japan or Canada,
the European Union.
European Union, which is a very big on its own unit, they will have to realign trade relations amongst themselves in order to deal with this kind of challenge that is there right now in front of them. Because he has kind of declared this trade war on everybody. And okay, the U.S. economy is very, the U.S. dollar is very strong, and it's still the fastest, it's still the largest economy, but it's not the fastest growing economy anymore.
Right.
Okay, it's growing around 2-3%, whereas the Chinese economy, even in a downward slide, is growing at 6%. So that's a huge difference. So the U.S. influence over the international economic, monetary, financial system is there, but it is not overwhelming to the extent that Mr. Trump assumes it is, which will enable him to prevail upon everyone else. And that's the problem.
Absolutely.
He's no longer in that, the US is no longer in that kind of unassailable supreme position.
So we are looking at a disruption of international trade in many different ways as a result of these policies. Another question is about the raising of these tariffs, and we've seen that after these raise in tariffs by the US, we've seen a tit-for-tat reaction from most other countries that are dealing with the US. We've seen the same from Canada, we've seen it from the European Union, and now we're seeing it from China as well. Well, when we have this sort of a bad spiral, which is quite visible, what is the end result?
That's why we say following the rules, because WTO has very significantly mentioned a kind of ratio which you can put on the duties, not more than that, it is 20%. And that is equally for every country, and that is according to your volume of your trade also. And that is why I've said it is relative gains, it's no zero-sum gains now in this, now we are not living in a mercantilism era. So this is the globalization, everybody has to get something out of something. So if that retaliation will go up, of course the suffering will be for everyone. And then the recession, the earlier recession because even the Pakistan sustained that recession. Many countries sustained that recession. But now this recession will be more severe, and maybe no country will be out of it, and every country will be affected, because now it is going to be a kind of a war.
And ma'am, what effect will it have on the developing and poorer countries? Because obviously that effect would be far more devastating than for countries such as the US or the European Union, for example.
Because, for instance, we have a trade relation, major trade partner is United States, and then EU. And then you don't have a kind of that consumption there of your goods, then of course your economy is also affected. So trade basically is the major instrument of your economic relation in this world at this moment, after this third wave of globalization in the 1980s. But now at this time, what Trump has started, this protectionism, this will affect every country negatively.
Very unfortunate situation that we're heading towards. Another one of the effects of Donald Trump's policies on the global economy, sir, is uncertainty in financial markets, and that's also something that we are witnessing even in Pakistan. So if you could please also explain to us that what is the relationship between the financial markets of the world and how these policies are going to be affecting business in the financial markets.
Well, again, you know, it's all tied to this globalized system of business. And so the financial markets, basically, where you have excess capital or disposable income, you are able to invest that in emerging markets or wherever you feel there are good opportunities to make profits. So if we do hit a recession and the money supply contracts, there's not enough, and people are hedging their bets.
So it's adversely going to affect growth.
So they are going to be more careful about investing anywhere, let alone in emerging markets, but even in established markets.
Right.
So this kind of knock-on effect, it will have a kind of a multiplier effect on the financial markets as well. And that is really bad news for, you mentioned developing countries, especially bad news for developing countries. And we as a country, as a developing country, has already been facing a current account deficit, and our exports have been declining. And we really need to realign our trade policy and our exports and try and find new markets, go into new areas, and try and sustain and prepare for this kind of eventuality if it comes about.
That's a very interesting point you raised, sir, because China, we are witnessing, is already doing what you just suggested, that they're looking for other markets to replace the business that they're doing with the US. Why are other countries not following suit is the obvious question.
Well, they are following suit, but then they were caught on the wrong foot. I mean, they assumed that the Americans will not throw everything out of the door.
Right.
I mean, they thought, well, okay, they will have problems with China.
So they didn't take that threat seriously.
Yes, they didn't. I mean, Mexicans probably felt that NAFTA was going to survive Mr. Trump's accusations, and so did the Canadians. But obviously it hasn't worked that way.
Yes, sir.
And they didn't expect what happened in the last G8 summit.
That too, sir.
So that was totally miscalculation on their part, and now they're catching up. I mean, one of the other important things which a lot of people have not noticed, and that's relevant for China and the Chinese role, is that for the first time, IMF has accepted the Chinese currency as one of the basket of currencies. Okay. As you know, previously it was only the Western so-called convertible currencies. Now the yuan is there. That is good news for countries like us, but is also something which is a recognition of the strength of the growing, of the strength of the Chinese economy.
Absolutely, sir. Well, next question, ma'am, is regarding the mounting tensions that are also, as a result of these trade policies, they're also sort of going into the political realm, and we have a lot of tension in that aspect as well. How is that going to be affecting business with the US?
Yes, of course. I mean, if you look at the Chinese authorities concerned at this moment, they are very much concerned that We did not expect that there will be anti-Chinese sentiments to that extent mounting in US.
Right.
And of course, it will affect your diplomatic ties itself. And then again, what we see is economic recession with vis-a-vis a kind of a Cold War kind of a thing.
Right.
And that will affect, that will make a different blocks, that will affect the different countries, and that will affect the development of the whole world, basically.
Right.
So this will, of course, now when we say the political economy, that's why we say that where economics and politics meets.
Yes, but I also meant that when we talk about the US economy to be such a strong and stable economy,
Yeah.
isn't that also going to affect the US economic standing in the world? Business confidence in the US economy will also fade, and as a result, it will damage
Of
the
course,
US economy.
I mean, you talked about predictability and uncertainty. When there is a market economy, so one of the fundamental principle of the market economy is this certainty and the predictability. When they both are not there in the US economic system or economic policy, of course, the word investor will automatically, they will shy from investing in the US also. So in the long run, as we said, in the long run, it is against the US own interests, but they will learn after some time, as they have learned in Iraq and Afghanistan after some time.
We're not sure whether they've learned anything there.
Hope so.
So, moving on, when we talk about the US economy and the policies or the policy direction that Mr. Donald Trump is going in, we saw that recently there were a number of tax cuts that were given to the US consumers, and those tax cuts have gone down very well. They've helped the US economy. But now when we see these extra tariffs that Mr. Trump is planning on imposing or is imposing, is that going to impact the benefits of the US tax cuts? Is that going to cancel it out?
Well, you know, that's his approach, or that's a particular kind of approach in the US, mainly by the Republican Party, where they think that giving tax breaks to the business community is going to generate economic activity and therefore create more employment and therefore be helpful for the overall economic, for the overall economy of the country. Now that's one approach. You can have a different approach as was pursued by President Obama's Democrat government, which is basically that you got to have enough money to spend on welfare and on the poorer segments of the population. So what this is doing is actually taking money away from those programs that were meant to be, you know, not just welfare, but basically meant to help the poorer sections of American society, and taking money away from there and giving tax breaks to the more affluent parts. It's debatable whether that will be the long-term benefit.
But
yes.
we've seen in the short term in
you
the
will see
US that has
yes,
had benefits.
It is because people, you know, they've got tax breaks, so they want to
Spend more money.
They spend more money and all
Right.
that. But then there's a whole new question, and this has not really been resolved. First of all, will those profits go to enrich the total population? I mean, in other words, will the rich only get richer and the poorer continue to get poorer? I mean, you've seen so
That's
many,
what we've usually seen,
yeah,
sir. That,
and so, you know, as they say, the American economy, only 1% contains, if you read these the major writers on the US economy,
right, sir.
1% of the American population contains 99% of the economy. So it's a huge, big difference out there.
So that is a very unfortunate situation for the taxpayers in the US, the common citizens. A large number of farmers also voted for Donald Trump, and now they're feeling the pinch because a number of farm produce of the United States that is exported to places like China are now going to be taxed 25% tariffs, which are going to be reciprocal. How is that going to affect Mr. Donald Trump's tax base, his voting base rather?
Very negatively. Actually, what we avoid in the economic system is the regressive taxes, which Donald Trump is now, he's following that principle. And we have seen here in Pakistan through that taxes when we say there will be trickle down effect and then there will be less gap, and the gap will be bridged between the poor and the richer.
That never
didn't
happens.
happen. So that will be the same situation in now.
But when we've seen in practice, ma'am, that this theory never actually works practically, then why is this theory always promoted so much?
He is trying to, no.
Many countries, not just the US, they also follow the same sort of point of view,
But
and
then
their policies
then
are also
you
based
need a
on
lot
this
of-
assumption that the trickle-down economy will work, but it never does. We've seen that as a practical example. It's glaring, staring every Pakistani in the face.
Well, if you permit, I mean,
Sir,
my view is, and I'm not I've studied economics, but I'm not an economist in the real sense.
So,
But my sense is that trickle down can only come into force not out of its own free will. You know, the government has to have policies that's going to ensure that that is what is going to happen.
right.
But this idea that, you know, this laissez-faire idea that, you know, there will be, if
Let the
there's
markets
enough-
decide.
Let the
That's
market
not going to
decide.
work.
I believe in more of the Keynesian approach to
Absolutely,
economics,
sir.
where the government has to step in.
The
and
regulation has to play a
Yeah.
very major role. Without regulation, it's going to be
You
anarchy.
need a proper actually regulation and a monitoring. The
Both.
government need to be there.
Absolutely.
Government need to be there through policies, and then government need to be there through intervention also. When you leave it to the trickle down, then of course there will be more profiteers, and then there will be more gap.
And then in
That's what is
countries like
happening.
ours, of course, you know, we have seen this, we are still seeing this, a lot of the profits that are being made by the major industrialists and others, a lot of the profits are just being sent out of the country. Before the program, we were talking about this amnesty scheme.
Right, sir.
Why do we have to have an amnesty scheme? Why are people allowed to put their money abroad, which they have earned here?
These are very good, glaring questions, sir, and I don't have the answers to that. But I'll take the next question to Madam Noor Fatima. Ma'am, we also have the stock exchanges of the world, which are being adversely affected by these policies. Dow Jones, which is one of the major stock exchanges in the US, that has plunged 421 points because of this US trade war with the EU and China. And Wall Street is also in a panic because of the steep drop in the index. How are the stock markets of the US and the rest of the world also reacting to these new tariff policies of the US?
Actually, what is coming to my mind is 1997, the East Asian market, when that was crashed because of the speculations. What will happen, how this policy of protectionism will go, how he's taking these unilateral decisions is the different thing, but the market panic comes immediately. That is an instant reaction, and that will damage more to the United States stock markets and business more than the actual policies. The actual policy result will come somehow later. The stock markets, they will come down, they will crash because speculation. Look what happened in the one speculation came from the baht of the Thailand at that time, 1987, and it took whole East Asian market down. That can be actually a good example now for us to look into history and learn. And this is why we say the speculation and uncertainty, too bad thing for the market economy that we see now. We can anticipate that.
Very unfortunate. Sir, just as a hypothetical question, if we go further, we take this policy direction of Donald Trump further, and we start seeing all economies or all countries following the same sort of principle, we end up in a situation where countries stop doing business with each other. That's the kind of direction we are heading into. What would happen if that were the global business structure then, if countries stop dealing with each other as a result?
I think that they will not stop dealing with each other. I think they will need to realign their trading policies more towards countries with which they can have a better trade relationship. So, because as I said before, since Mr. Trump has taken on everybody at the same time, he simply cannot win this.
Well, my question, sir,
what the others will do is realign amongst themselves.
If we could simplify this question, what if the other countries of the world were to boycott American products wholesale? What would be the effect on the American economy then?
Of course, the American economy would go down, sink like a stone, but it won't be as bad as that, because American economy has enough capacity domestically to absorb.
That is
this
one of the
kind
major
stuff,
issues on
right?
which they're playing this
Yeah,
game, sir.
so they can absorb, but it's not, no, and America is not an island, okay? It's a big country, it's a powerful country and all that sort of thing, but it still needs to engage in trade. And if it's not pursuing a fair trade relationship, other countries will readjust and find markets for their products elsewhere.
So in any case, eventually the US will be the eventual loser in this entire
they will
situation.
be the loser in this.
So it doesn't make any sense that why would they follow this sort of a policy direction when the results are clear for everybody to see where they're going to lead, which is not a very good place, sir. Again, it boggles the mind that why would they come up with such policies? As a result, they've also been they've started to witness American companies now react to these policies. For example, Harley Davidson, sir, is one of the biggest motorcycle companies in the world. They have moved their production operations outside the US so they can avoid those steel and aluminum tariffs.
Not just IBM. This iPhone, this is made in China.
Right, sir.
I mean, it's an American company, but they
manufacturing in
manufactured in China.
So
when they are putting these kind of restrictions on the Chinese, it will also hurt American businessmen who are producing in China to export to the US and elsewhere.
Absolutely.
So this is one of the points that the Chinese have made, that you are trying to hurt the Chinese economy, or you are going to hurt China, but you are in the process also hurting American manufacturers, many of whom are working from China. I mean, this is one example.
Right.
Harley Davidson, but other big ones like Westinghouse.
Well, Mr. Trump is really angry and upset about Harley Davidson moving their operations to Europe.
But many will.
So what is that going to achieve, sir?
So that's the kind of problem that he has not anticipated is going to happen, but anyone with half a brain could have told him that this would happen.
Well, it's an unfortunate situation that we are heading towards, sir, but there's a lot of politics also that is being played on the sidelines of this economic war, sir. Especially when we look at what's happening in the South China Sea, that seems to be a cause for concern for the US. In your opinion, ma'am, we have Mr. Jim Mattis visiting China to sort out these issues, but then there's also the question of Taiwan, which irks the Chinese as well. How is the political aspect of this going to play in the next coming months?
Actually, now the US is feeling somehow a bit insecure also in South China Sea, because China is resolving its issue with other rivals, including India, if you see. Now China is having more warm relations with India in economic terms also. Whereas India, no doubt, is siding with China, with the US. But of course, India would look at its interests first. So I think China, somehow, the US is through its own policy against the rivalry of China, is itself feeling insecurity in that South China Sea also. Because South China Sea, the major claimer of that area is claimed by the China, of course, and China is all out to protect that. It's right. So in that way, China, the US is feeling quite insecure, and the US is not that much into the security that China, that US will have that influence in that area. So in a way, somehow, US has this feeling that politically they have generated a lot of anti-US sentiments in this area, and including China. So in that way, US will face such kind of now more, how we can say, anti-sentiments against US.
Antagonism.
Yes.
Well, I'll bring the same question to you, sir. What do you make of this particular visit of Mr. Jim Mattis at this particular point in time when we have the Korean denuclearization issue very high on the US agenda? We have, of course, we have Taiwan. All these issues, sir, they're coming together. And there is the perception, which has been voiced by China and other countries, that the US is using bullying tactics, and these trade wars are further bullying to, just to sort of roll over the wishes or desires of the other countries at their cost. So do you think that is going to play out well, sir, in the coming months?
Well, I think that we need to be able to distinguish between this trade war, as you are describing it, unleashed by Mr. Trump, and the overall US approach towards China in a kind of geopolitical sense, which precedes Mr. Trump's presidency. I think I would take it back even towards the time of President Clinton, Bush.
Because they also accuse that this trade war has been initiated or started by China and not the US. That's one of the claims that are also being made by the US.
That is a claim, but I'm talking about the geopolitical competition between the United States and China. The fact of the matter is that after the Cold War ended, with the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, the United States emerged as a kind of sole superpower. And it was determined to ensure that no other power emerges that can challenge America's unipolar authority in the world. But as we know, the US got itself into problems, Iraq, Afghanistan and others, the recession and the whole bit about the American economy, with the result that China, on the other hand, has emerged as a powerful contender. At the same time, the US has antagonized the Russians in Europe because of Ukraine and other issues. And so you have now a multipolar world in which you have the United States now, due to Mr. Trump, virtually on their own. And on the other hand, you have China and Russia, which are moving closer and closer, as you see in the last summit, SCO summit that took place. In this environment, of course, the US is trying to gain allies. It has already some traditional allies like Japan or Australia from the early days. It has reinforced those alliances and it is building new allies. For instance, our neighbor, India, Vietnam, others. And you recently, if you were following, there was this big annual meeting in Singapore, which is called the Shangri-La Dialogue, where the Indian Prime Minister and the American Defense Secretary, Mr. Mattis, were keynote speakers. And there is a lot of convergence in their approaches vis-a-vis China. Okay? Now here you see that there is a quadrilateral alliance in what they now call the Indo-Pacific, which means they're joining the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Oceans together, and this quadrilateral alliance involves not only the United States, Australia, Japan, but also India.
Right.
This, in real terms, actually amounts to ganging up against China.
Absolutely, and that's how the Chinese are perceiving it as well.
So, but my argument is that if you look at the chronology of these developments, the Chinese are actually reacting to what was being done from the time of President Clinton to the present time against China to contain China. So the argument that we are doing this because China is an aggressive power and the South China Sea, they are doing this and that,
doesn't really have much merit.
It's the reverse. They are reacting to what the US and its
because
allies
they
are
recently disinvited China from the military exercises that are taking place
They've
in the
done a number of
Indo-Pacific.
things. I mean, we don't have time, but I can go through a whole list of things that have been done to isolate China in that region.
All right, so but we leave it at that. Thank you very much for taking out the time and sharing your views with PTV World. Well, you heard the conversation, and as always, we like to say, please draw your own conclusions from what you've heard. We just hope that the trade wars that have been initiated by Donald Trump do not end up engulfing the entire world and are detrimental for everybody, including the US. With that hope and on that note, it's goodbye.